This video is part 2 of Chapter 3, Alfred Adler. We're shifting our emphasis now in the direction of what Adler meant by this human tendency toward social interest and cooperation. Remember how he argues that human beings at their best, when they are fully developed and functional, they show social interest, and they are cooperative, they are altruistic. Adler saw social interest in terms of this additional concept that he used called community feeling. So he referred to this idea of being emotionally connected to our communities, the people that surround us, and that serves a very individual purpose. So it's not really selfish purposes. So you're not using people to benefit yourself. You are engaged in the lives of others for the sake of the whole group. And, he contrasted people who were power hungry, who can use others, and they seem to be socially interested, but they're really into their involvements for themselves, as opposed to truly well-developed, fully functioning human beings who are committed to others. They're committed to engaging in cooperative activity that serves the needs of the whole community itself. And Adler believed that this was, a motivation that's woven into the fabric of who human beings are. If they have good developmental circumstances, if they've had appropriate parenting and good education, he argued that people would naturally move in this direction of social interest. If, however, they did not, if they had problems in development, negative surroundings, then they may move in a more selfish direction. His writing includes this idea that I've put in this quote here: ideal community of all mankind is connected to this concept of social interest. He argues that the species as a whole is really dependent on having evolved this capacity for social cooperation. Cooperation in the Adlerian model is one element of social interest. He argues, Freud believed that we were dependent on each other, but that dependency also came with a cost, and the cost was that we had to develop a conscience. So Adler is kind of rejecting that logic and replacing it with this notion that there's actually a clear evolutionary advantage to human beings being socially cooperative and being invested emotionally in their wider communities. It does serve the needs of both the individual and the whole. He believed that human beings evolved as a species to have these feelings of social interest and cooperation, and because they pay off from a species point of view. At an emotional level, though, he argued that there are deeply rewarding experiences of positive emotions associated with cooperativeness. He believed that what empowers one, if it is engaged in for social interested reasons, empowers all. So in this way, our ability to let's say, achieve our own personal life goals means the enhancement of other people's ability to achieve their life goals. So, when we're thinking of this cooperation idea in Adlerian theory, he believed that, in order to be successful, both as individuals and as communities, we have to engage in cooperative action. Lack of cooperation, he believed, at an individual level leads to neurosis. At a group level, it leads to social dysfunction. So back to these ideas of basic Adlerian principles. Adler believed that all behaviors are socially embedded. This is an idea that we're going to come back to next week when we talk about Karen Horney's theory, because she believed the same thing, that all behavior is social and is embedded in a social context. And therefore, you can't really understand human beings outside of that social context. He also believed, as I just said, that cooperation is something that evolved as part of the human species and therefore is a biological need. We're driven toward it, and he argued that when people show an abject lack of ability to engage cooperatively, that there's something neurotic going on there. So he saw that as a primary indicator of maladaptation. He believed that this was related to the fact that, we have human infants are born weak. They're born incapable of surviving on their own. Therefore, our original state, our infant state, which is such complete dependency, we have to rely on the cooperation initially of our immediate caregivers, and then at later points in time we have to continue as we grow and get through childhood to rely on cooperation from others to take care of us. Even in adulthood, we will require some degree of cooperation to continue being able to pursue our own individual lives. So we are kind of built as a species on this necessity for cooperation. He also then, by extension, and this will be an idea, I feel like I'm doing this a lot with Adler, this is an idea that Abraham Maslow really emphasized in his theory. You might remember the Maslow hierarchy of needs. This is one of them. The need for belongingness, the need to connect to others and belong to social groups, he believed is fundamental to human nature. And you probably see that in your own experiences of yourself. We like to feel that we are a part of something, and when we experience a great deal of pain, when we're rejected, that should indicate to you sort of the importance of this need for belonging. The concept of holism in Adlerian theories is, it kind of goes against that reductive quality of, you're reducing all things to one element. He goes in a different direction. He argues that, our central drive toward achieving our life goals, our formed, understood life goals, is more holistic. It goes beyond the simple one-directional expression of inner drives. It's more than that. It's wrapped into our social experiences. It's wrapped into our contextual experiences, and so on. The unconscious, for Adler, he used it in not so much as a structure, but as a descriptor. Unconscious processes for Adler are part of how people go about pursuing their goals. So our unconscious processes, we may not be consciously aware of how a particular thought or feeling or action is connected to what we're trying to achieve in terms of wholeness and completeness. Or we might be fully conscious. So there are both unconscious and conscious elements to our expression of the need to achieve our life goals. So unconscious, it isn't a structure in the way that it would be in, say, Freud or Jung's theory. The next Adlerian principle is this idea that behavior is connected to how we perceive reality. So again, Adler is kind of foreshadowing some of the later theorists who would really be emphasizing cognition and thinking. Human beings are thinking creatures. We draw conclusions based on our perception of what we experience. And that means that everybody's experience is going to be somewhat different. So our own perception of reality is based on just what we are perceiving. And it may not be directly tethered to objective reality. So to understand people, Adler believed you really had to sort of develop a map of their style of life within the context of that person's perception of reality. This idea of mapping out the person's cognitive organization, we're going to see that as being foundational to George Kelly's theory in a little while later in the semester. So kind of file that away. You're starting to get a theme here. Adler was a precursor to lots of other theories, both in the cognitive domain as well as in the humanistic domain. The next principle is this idea that we're focused on the future. We're very future-oriented. And this stands in contrast to the Freudian idea that everything is about the past. Everything is about what's in the unconscious. And so we're very backward looking. What we're doing now is pretty much reliably in terms of what came before. Adler was really focused on the opposite. It's not really about what happened in the past. It's what we want. So he saw human beings motivated far more by what they see in their future rather than what experiences they might have had or tucked away in their unconscious in the past. So we're looking for if we want to describe people, we want to look at what's motivating them, what's moving them in the direction of the future. Like Freud, but Adler did see all behavior as being interpretable, but he saw all behavior as having a purpose, and that purpose was connected to this goal-driven nature of human beings. So if you want to understand a person, what you're trying to discover is the goal that they see themselves oriented toward, that they believe will bring them a sense of peace or a sense of happiness. If people are unhappy, Adler tended to describe what needs to happen less in the construct of psychotherapy or psychoanalysis, more particularly, which involves backward acting, uncovering of the past, decoding of the subconscious or the unconscious. Instead, he argues it's a process of re-education when I look at it, it's pretty forward-looking. It's saying, the goal here is not to dig around in the weeds of your past. It is to restructure your perception of the future. So when you're looking at what meaning do people give to the lives that they choose to live, he's giving people more control over themselves than, say, Freud would. He says that therapy then is really a chance for people to restructure their thinking about their choices and their possibilities. Again, this is a precursor to later forms of cognitive therapies, like those of Albert Ellis, really have a direct tie to some of the ideas that Adler is proposing here about therapy as re-education. So how did Adler characterize psychological growth? Essentially, he felt that over the course of the developmental period, you're moving from ego-driven, self-centered goals of personal overcoming, of personal power, and moving in the direction of being able to look at your own satisfaction of your own personal life goals as being integrated into the broader social world. So he really embeds this idea of superiority, of conquering adversity, of overcoming. He puts that in the context of what he called constructive mastery. Overcoming the physical, the environment that surrounds you, and pursuing your own life goals in a way that's socially appropriate and socially beneficial. Constructive striving, then, to put it in the frame that Adler is using here, constructive striving joins with this constructive social interest, because you can either be constructive in your approach to life, or you can be destructive in your approach to life. You can either be active in your striving, or you can be passive in your striving. For Adler, the most healthy approach to life, and this would be if you were doing therapy, you were educating people to move in this direction, the healthiest version is being both active and constructive in your style of life, meaning that you take personal responsibility for choices, you're actively challenging the things that are getting in your way, you're actively constructing a pathway toward achieving your life goal, and you're doing so in a constructive way that is of use to the people around you. There's also passively constructive. You're showing social interest, but you're being passive about it. You're sort of allowing things to occur, and as they occur, they may add to your growth, but you're not actively creating opportunities. The destructive styles of life, you can be actively destructive. That's when you are basically predatory in your use of power and selfish in what you're doing, especially in the form of taking advantage of others and harming them. Passively destructive people essentially allow bad things to occur, allow things to harm others, and don't really take an active role in creating devastation for other people. Now, life tasks are, I kind of look at them as elements of, they're more behavioral elements of the pursuit of life goals. The particular life tasks that Adler focused on start with work. Now, you could, as we look at these life tasks, remember that he's coming at this from the point of view of being, from a masculine point of view, and recognizing that for his time period, for women, work took a particular form, and for men, work took a particular form. As a life task, as something that people do with their time, the same rules apply. It should be, at its best, work should provide you with an active, constructive outlet for your own experience of who you are. So work provides people with an ability to become satisfied with themselves, to develop self-worth and self-esteem in that active, constructive environment. So notice that he's putting the extent to which the work benefits others in the front row here. Work is its most meaningful when it is socially invested. Friendships, he argued, were a life task. He saw having friendships within your community, whatever that community is, as being an essential component to the capacity to engage in community growth and development. And as such, it was an important part of individual personality development. Love, he distinguished from friendship as more in the intimate relationship sphere. He felt that being able to have successful love relationships, successful intimate relationships, is the ultimate expression of cooperative social interest in a dyad, in a couple. There are other kinds of life tasks as well, and other Adlerian theorists have conceptualized life tasks in somewhat different ways. The first, you can talk about society, social interaction, general social sharing as a life task, work and occupational life tasks, sex, love, and intimacy, that partnership. Some Adlerian theorists have also added spiritual path as a part of the life task. And that kind of broadens the scope of the life task that can be embedded into someone's personal style of life and their personal life goals. Coming to self-acceptance is also a life task that some Adlerians will include in this discussion. So what you're seeing here kind of on this list, and if you go back earlier in the presentation to that tree image, and there's a list of life tasks off to the right-hand side, you'll see some other alternative lists of ways of wording these various life tasks. But you've got deeply individual ones, like coming to terms with who you are and accepting who you are. There's a spiritual sphere, the dyadic love intimacy, relationships, work, and then social experiences as well. What are the things that get in the way of growth and development for Adler? Initially, we all have to cope with organ inferiorities. Illness, disability, all of those things about our bodies that let us down, if you will, or that challenge us in terms of living in a world that isn't designed for us, given our specific physicalities. We have our first experiences with or quote-unquote organ inferiority or perceptions of inferiority as small children because our bodies just haven't grown yet. But in our later in childhood, in adulthood, we also experience organ inferiorities across the lifespan as our bodies challenge us, and our perception of our bodies can challenge us as well. He also talks about, and you heard this in the little video clip, about the dangers of spoiling children. He saw this in particular as he was working in the United States. He had a growing concern that Americans had a tendency to pamper their children and spoil them by being too protective of them and too isolating of them. He probably would have been disturbed by a tendency that has characterized parenting in U.S. culture, at least in middle class and upper class demographics, of really trying to ensure that the self-esteem of little children is always buffered and protected to such a degree that children never get any experience with failure and challenge. He felt there was a real danger to spoiling and overprotecting children because in order to become appropriately socially interested and appropriately cooperative, children need to embrace the fact that they have weaknesses, and overcoming them fully and in a healthy way requires the participation of others. It also requires direct experience with failure at tasks. He felt that the best developmental experiences involved learning to work hard to overcome current limitations such that you master a particular set of skills that came with costs to you. He also felt that, kind of in opposition to pampering, if children are neglected or overtly abused by those who are supposed to be caring for them, but particularly he wrote quite passionately about neglect. Unwanted children, neglected children who haven't been loved, who haven't been shown the cooperation that it takes for good parenting, they tend to become, in his opinion, cold. So the pampered child becomes selfish and self-focused and more likely to engage in actively destructive styles of life or passively destructive styles of life. The neglected child similarly may be ego-driven, perhaps selfish, but in a cold, self-protective way. They've never come to rely on their parents to have their best interests in heart. They've never had that supportive parent or adult who supported them through their efforts to overcome challenges that come their way. So what Adler's really suggesting here about childhood is that good parenting requires parents who are adept at balancing, allowing their children to experience the world and experience themselves in the world in such a way that they can face challenges, fail, push hard to overcome, and experience the joy of mastering a task that was challenging for them to learn, and supporting them through that. So children need to feel that their parents trust them to try and trust them to be able to push through failures and difficulties, and trust them to define success for themselves. At the same time, they need to know that someone's going to be there to help them struggle through those successes and failures. Someone who's going to support them when they succeed and have their back when they fail, and keep giving them that cushion, but not pampering them to such a degree that they never know failure and therefore don't take responsibility for their own growth and development. So neurosis, in the Adlerian system, he argued that you understand neurotic or pathological personality in terms of negative pathways to overcoming inferiority. So neurosis is going to be descriptive of unhealthy pathways that people have developed for trying to conquer challenges. Now remember, the ideal person in the Adlerian system is actively constructive in their approach to overcoming challenges. Neurotic is going to come in the form of more passive approaches, but also the actively destructive approaches as well. Neurosis in the Adlerian system also tends to be isolating, because as people move in neurotic directions, whether it's because of their passivity or it's because of their destructiveness, they tend to have less successful friendships, less successful work relationships, and less successful intimate relationships. So he saw neurosis as something that takes away from our capacity to be connected to other people. Part of this was in terms of, the ineffectiveness of neurotic people in solving their basic life problems, or their life tasks. So think of that list of life tasks, whether it's the short one that goes directly back to Adler, or the more longer lists of life tasks that came on that alternative list. If people aren't very good at solving basic life tasks and managing them, then it tends to interfere with their ability to be successful at work and in their relationships. And that's really the essence of neurotic functioning. So just as an extension of what I just argued, these neurotic tendencies, whether they're directly related to destructive lifestyles or through passive expressions of constructive patterns, what tends to happen, in Adler's opinion, is that neurotic people become intolerant, they may become hypersensitive, so they may show in their feelings, their cognitions, their behaviors, a weakened ego state, and difficulties in kind of working collectively and cooperatively to achieve goals. In some cases, he made the argument that people who have neurotic tendencies within their lifestyles experience this kind of estrangement from reality. And he's not referring to psychosis there, but to living in this space where their perception of what's really happening isn't what's really happening. So the neurotic person may have a great deal of difficulty stepping outside of themselves to see how other people see them. And that interferes with their capacity to grow. So people get stuck because they've lost that reflective capacity that truly well-adjusted people have, which is the ability to say, Yes, I understand how when I do X, other people see that I'm doing X and they know why I'm doing X. So you can stand outside yourself and see when you've done something right, when you've done something wrong, when you've done something well, when you've done it poorly. The neurotic person, in Adler's estimation, can't do that with any kind of reliable accuracy. So they have problem kind of making sense of why other people see them as flawed. Also, he argued that there are times when, there's a particular kind of expression of neurosis that can take the form of persistently embracing suffering as a lifestyle. You may know someone like this who, their whole existence is really tethered to the fact that they are unhappy. And their unhappiness may be tied to, say, seeing themselves as ill, feeling themselves as physically having problems, or it may be because they identify the suffering in their lives as being the central portion of who they are as people. So you probably know someone who, really their way of communicating who they are is strictly through the lens of all the bad things that have happened to them. He sees this as a very past-oriented kind of way of living. So if it's suffering related to past experiences, the person's just stuck in the suffering and not really oriented toward thinking into the future about what they could choose to do. If it's a current state of suffering, they're stuck in the present. And in order to become more healthy, in order to embrace a healthy, constructive, actively pursued sense of superiority, they have to shed this sense that their suffering is somehow a point of honor, that other people need to value and respect. So he sees, people who get they get wallowy in their own suffering as getting stuck developmentally. Another source of neurosis is an attempt to become, to embrace the extreme separateness of being a rebel, basically, saying you want to let go of all of the rules that society has and embrace the opposite. Now, in some cases, he talked about this as an extreme anxiety reaction, where people they'll kind of resign from life and hide. In other respects, it could be someone who compulsively engages in behaviors. He did, in some of his writing, kind of cross the line into describing more overtly psychotic symptoms, things like hallucinations and delusions, that could take hold in individuals of this kind, but not always. So, in some cases, he argued that the neurosis can manifest itself in more severe ways that were more overtly problematic for people living in an engaged way in their social world. In this case, you have, logical thinking gets sort of overridden by the embracing of an alternative way of viewing the world. He talked about neurotic isolation in terms of how it interferes with our social life, our ability to love and be compassionate. Since we're neurotically isolating, everything will put, the person will put all of their power into trying to isolate further. So what happens developmentally is that the person isn't going to be able to move away from the fear that is consuming them and keeping them isolated from other people. So they may have constructed an entire belief system that supports the fact that the world is a terrifying place. In order to continue to exist, they need to isolate themselves from other people, not trusting them, and their ability, their expression of this drive toward mastery becomes, how can I master my isolation? in order to control what I can control. If I can't control the world, I'm going to control my isolated space. So neurotic people are basically seeking personal power in ways that are unhealthy. It could be a pure ego-driven desire for power, for having other people value you, which is, the prestige idea. Try to make excuses for real life problems that remain unresolved. And he argued that these neurotic tendencies, whichever form they take, are going to interfere with the capacity for true social interest. So when people are neurotic, they become self-driven, and either through their beliefs or their emotional reactions or their behavioral patterns, they cannot meaningfully and cooperatively engage with other people. To combat neurosis, what the therapist has to do is reconstruct the person's orientation to seeking personal power. So, as I said earlier, this is a real foreshadowing of cognitive therapy approaches, because what you're really doing is saying you have to take apart the person's schematic representation of themselves and their orientation to the world, and then reconstruct it. You have to change the way they're oriented to their world. If they suffered from pampering or neglect, if they had difficult physical challenges across childhood, other kinds of problems during upbringing, the therapist's job is to deconstruct those perceptions, those mindsets, and help the person to redefine their life tasks with a strong foundation of social interest. So the goal is always going to be that idea of cooperative social interest for the person. Because for Adler, he was utterly and completely committed to that, which would be a really foreign idea for Freud. For Freud, being socially interested is essentially a way of defending the person, because the person's true nature is utterly evil. Adler went beyond that to say, no, we're not by our nature evil, we're by our nature cooperative and socially interested. We've evolved as a species needing each other. Therefore, our inner nature is one that's deeply cooperative if we're raised in such a way that we can embrace that. Neurosis happens when we're raised in such a way that we can't. So therapy is designed to bring us back to that base of social interest. The role of emotion in Adler's theory it isn't always clear. The model, to me, it comes from a deeply psychoanalytic base where there is some conflict that's built into the system. But then there's this really strong current of cognition and schemas. So sometimes it's hard to identify where emotion plays in all of this. Adler talked about what he called socially disjunctive emotions that are connected to our process of trying to achieve life tasks and goals. He also talked about socially conjunctive emotions. Socially disjunctive emotions kind of go to that. Remember that one diagram that I gave you that had two branches? You can either move in the direction of the personal, individual goal attainment that isn't deeply connected to our broader cultural community connections, or the right-hand branch of that tree, which goes much more directly to the point of human existence, which is cooperation and social interaction. Socially disjunctive emotions, like anxiety and fear and things like disgust, which tend to then foster prejudice and discrimination, those tend to push people in more individualistic, less socially constructive directions, and sometimes overtly destructive directions. Socially conjunctive emotions, things like empathy and kindness, those promote social interaction. So the socially disjunctive emotions lead to that they come from failure experiences that were not positioned in an appropriate context, and they push the person in the direction of being more self-protective. So if you think about fear and anger are essentially, and disgust for that matter, are intended to be self-protective devices. We feel angry when someone has harmed us or intended to harm us. We feel fear when something is going to hurt us. We feel disgust when something sickens us. So they're protective. They're designed to be self-protective. So they're disjunctive in Adler's system because they interfere with our capacity to experience empathy and by extension, our willingness to be cooperative and socially engaged. So when that happens, they are problematic. So conjunctive emotions tend to be more socially oriented. They tend to be more joy-oriented, so wanting to share joy with others, enjoy them and enjoy their successes, and feel suffering when they suffer. So empathy is purely in play here, as well as sympathy. When we sympathize with others and when we empathize with others, Adler would see that in this quote, the purest expression of social interest. When we can relate to others, when we can understand their suffering, that's the gateway to actually actively, constructively engaged behavior. And for Adler, that was the highest level of human existence. Psychotherapy as a process, the basic goal of psychotherapy is getting people to reconstruct their beliefs and expectations about goals so that they become more socially useful. Again, this is a real precursor to what we're going to see later in Albert Ellis, in George Kelly, the very cognitivist idea that you have to change people's perceptions of what's possible in their own thinking. Now, for Adler, he's making a very direct statement that people are healthier, they're better when they're socially engaged. So there are three major aspects to this process. The first, and Adler felt this was incredibly important for the therapist to do, you have to get your head around the person's actual current lifestyle. So you have to get into their structure, basically. You have to understand their point of view. Then you have to help the patient, the person, understand themselves. So, you have, according to Adler, a particular lifestyle that's already functioning and it's running itself. If it's neurotic, you may not understand it as neurotic. You may have a perception that you're suffering, that you're unhappy, that things aren't going well, but you may not understand the ways in which your lifestyle is in play. So you, as the therapist, have to understand the person's personality, how it's structured. Then you have to help the patient get insight into it. Then you move in the direction of strengthening the social interest goal for the person. And by doing so, it basically restructures the lifestyle. So go back to that graphic from part 1 of the lecture where you had those two branches of possibility. The one is the more self-focused, ill-defined life goal that doesn't have a strong element of social interest and cooperation versus the healthy pathway. They both can come from exactly the same experiences in childhood, but they branch off in terms of whether or not there's a strong focus on social interest and cooperation. So how to heal people first is by engaging them in socially interested behaviors. By engaging them that way, it starts to restructure their orientation to their own lifestyle. And it can have the trickle-down impact then of redefining their overarching life goal in a more constructive and hopefully active form. In understanding the lifestyle, what a therapist will be doing with a client is to go through the process of engaging with the person to examine their goals and their expectations about their lives. And in particular, you're looking for ways in which the person is isolating, ways in which they are experiencing disjunctive emotions. The therapist is looking for themes that connect the person's behaviors together. There may be some examination of early memories, because you might want to, if you're an Adlerian therapist, be looking for organ inferiorities, be looking for early signs of pampering and neglect, and overt abuse. You're not digging in the memories to make them conscious. You're not digging for memories in order to resolve unresolved conflicts. It's more to inform the therapist as to the way in which this would affect the structure of the person's expectations and goals. The therapist also wants to pay attention to expressions of emotion and the way in which emotions become expressive behaviors. You're looking, as I said before, you're looking for history with the person of, overcoming physical obstacles, parental pampering and or parental neglect. I would also include in here, he did make mention of overt abuse. He also mentioned more structural elements of society, but he didn't give them a great deal of attention. To get the person to experience greater self-understanding, he used this concept of schema of apperception. If people have an erroneous schema for understanding their own world, they're going to have unattainable, unrealistic goals in terms of how they strive for superiority over others. They may have, really convoluted, unattainable goals, or overtly destructive goals with respect to others. And part of promoting self-understanding is helping people come to the understanding that what they have is an erroneous schema of apperception. In later cognitive theories, we'll see that, say in Albert Ellis's theory, in cognitive behavioral therapies for depression and other kinds of psychological problems, what you're helping people to do is deconstruct negative, inaccurate schematic representations of themselves, and then later you're going to reconstruct it in a more positive direction. So the purpose of self-understanding is get people to understand where they are so that they're in a position to correct their maladaptive style of life. That understanding happens in the form of taking constructive action in one's life. And that often means getting involved in social action and social transformation. Strengthening social interest then in this therapeutic process, the therapeutic relationship helps people engage in cooperative action and engage in socially interested activities. So, for example, Adler would sometimes encourage people to engage in volunteer work, to engage in cooperative tasks, no matter how inconsequential they might feel. They helped the person to connect to that sense of accomplishment and achievement by engaging in cooperative work. Being socially interested, even if you're doing so because your therapist asked you to give it a try, has psychological payoffs, according to Adler. And when you engage in it and feel that payoff, it has an impact in terms of redefining the sense of self. The therapist also provides some of that direct care and support that the person has been missing, that they haven't had, because often the neurotic person have self-isolated. They have cut themselves off because their relationships have been unfulfilling in the past, and the therapist can provide some of that care and encouragement and support by engaging in cooperative activities with them. So they may never have received that kind of care and support before from a cooperative partner in their own success. Now, once again, this is going to be a precursor to changes in the therapeutic process that we will see in humanism, especially in Carl Rogers, who put the person at the center of the therapeutic process. Gradually, Adler argued that what you're trying to do is pull the person away from being neurotically self-interested and instead being positively, actively, constructively working for other people and working for the betterment of other people. Even if that's in your individual pursuits, in the work that you do, doing the work well and doing so in a socially constructive way can be an appropriate part of achieving healthy, productive life goals. So the role of the therapist here is to work in the direction of, work in equality with the patient. And again, Adler was very forward-thinking here. This becomes very much like what we will see in the way feminist psychotherapy is constructed, where you have a sense of equal partnership between patient and therapist, and the more humanistic notions of Rogers' person-centered therapy. Adler felt that you have to model cooperative intent in therapy. You have to engage cooperatively in helping the person learn how to restructure their thinking about their own lifestyle in order to assist them in becoming more empowered. He advocated greater free discussion, but not the technique of free association. His goal was not so much to dig into using free association techniques, the deeply hidden unconscious. He prefers instead a free and open conversation about the person's experiences, their feelings, in order to help the person become more self-aware and more capable of making mindful decisions about how to reconstruct their life goals. The goal is to empower the patient, to help them change themselves. So he's really reconstructing the nature of the patient-therapist relationship in this description. So the ultimate goal is for the therapeutic process to empower the person so that they could fundamentally change, moving away from unhealthy, either overtly destructive lifestyles or simply passive lifestyles that don't have a fully positive developmental bent to them. So counseling is designed to help people change their existing lifestyle into a more actively constructive form. And that concludes my coverage of Chapter 3, Alfred Adler.